Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Topography Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Hoden, and today I'm flying solo and I'm sharing a idea that I've been working on for a little bit over a year now. And this began as a thought experiment. I was reading a book and they hypothesized that businesses in the future will start to be more network structured as opposed to hierarchically structured. And so I started thinking about what that might actually look like or how that could function. I'm looking at it mostly through the lens of being a landscape architect and how the design world functions. So that's kind of how my starting point for it. And so um, the more that I thought about it, and worked through this idea, the more I realized that it had a lot of merit, both as like a competitive business within the industry, but then also um, related to human flourishing and kind of human liberation. And then also, uh, if paired with blockchain technology, could scale to really any limit. And that's where it really started getting exciting, is moving from just thinking about it as a singular business and seeing that the blockchain, this is kind of a discovery, but discovering that blockchain technology could leverage this structure in a way that would have no limit in terms of how big it could scale to. Like, it could go from being a singular business to running the entire economy. And so I got really excited about it at that point. And so I'm going to share it. And I have some slides here to go through. So if you're just listening, you're going to miss out on some of the diagramming and a lot of the visual. So I really recommend finding a way to see this as a video if possible. But so here I will begin to share this presentation that I put together and go through my thinking on this. Okay, so I'm calling this concept Florescence and flourishing in Synarchy. And we'll get into what I mean by Synarchy here. But so why Synarchy? It is now possible to establish an economic structure that is controlled by the greater community, not just a handful of insiders, rewards every contributor in direct proportion to their overall contribution, is more innovative and more stable than the current system, thrives from and promotes human flourishing at the individual and collective level, is more competitive and more efficient than the current standard, and breaks free of the methods in which people are controlled and manipulated by big finance and also by big technology. So that's where I get really excited about it, is that this structure seemingly has the potential to counteract the dual forces that are keeping us sort of enslaved in this current era, which is through economic and technological control. Our money is funny money that's just printed on computer screens and distributed to insiders. Banks control a lot of our governmental systems, our social systems, and how we live our daily lives, and technology as well. The technologists are starting to spy on every single aspect of what we do. They're starting to collect data on basically every single thing that how we live, who we talk to, what our habits are, what our beliefs are, all of that. And then trading on that data, which is basically like slave trading. It's no longer about owning you as a person necessarily, but owning you through owning your data. And so technology is becoming basically like a digital slave trade. And so this structure here has the potential to counteract both of those, the economic and technological control. And so if it is possible, it is mandatory that we create businesses and industries that are guided by principles of human liberation and prosperity for all. And I believe that what I'm sharing now has the potential to do that. So stepping back and looking at kind of current structures, how they function, and then ultimately comparing them to this concept of synarchy. I'll start with heterarchy, which is basically just a pure network. And so it's a lot of, if you can see on the screen here, it's a lot of individual nodes that just kind of circulate in their world, and then they connect at these different touch points. And one way of thinking about it is like maybe an artist collective, if you're trying to think about this in the way of a maybe a structure of organization within the human world. And so artist collective, maybe they share some space or um, work together in some format, but they all are still individual artists pursuing their own um, creative agenda, their own financial aims. There's not really like one structure that they're working through. So hierarchy is still community governed. It's not driven by top down control. The information flows are horizontal, kind of taking place at these different touch points between each person. They're highly adaptive, flexible. Just going through some of the key strengths here. Um, High capacity for innovation, leverages individuality over strictly defined roles, wider, more equitable distribution of resources, um, and shared resources also. Um, Highly stable and resilient. And then that stability increases over time. So the longer you have kind of a functioning network, the more stable it becomes. Um, Highly efficient as well. There's not really overhead. It's kind of just people or entities circulating in their own orbits and then connecting. So, and that efficiency increases over time as well. There's multiple redundancies though, still, even though it's still a fairly efficient way of moving. And it's based on individual and group empowerment. So um, there's not like a force that's trying to hammer each of these individuals into place within a bigger structure. They're just kind of moving in their own orbits and then connecting at key points. Um, so it ends up if you think about it as a business, which a pure network really can't become a business, but um, it's a focus on long term over the immediate. So some of the key weaknesses, they can be easily dissolved or fractured. Um, they kind of they require shared operating principles that exist outside of having a shared sense of purpose. And that can sometimes be hard to keep together. And then basically it just lacks a shared purpose or a focal point. So it's hard to view the overall picture. So you can bring these different circulations into synergy, but you can't really see beyond one system or sector of that's circulating. So it's kind of that forest from the trees. You can see the trees, but it's hard to see the bigger forest. Um, and then there's no real business to develop if you're thinking about this as a business structure. It's kind of an inherently self-organizing thing, which also becomes one of its key strengths. It's individual agents or units that are operating autonomously. So that also ties in with that lack of shared purpose. And it lacks identity. Again, like think of an artist collective. There's not really like if you have a bunch of artists working in one building, that doesn't really create a strong brand for the overall because they're still just independently working in their own arena. Um, and as a business also, it's not able to centrally raise, hold, or deploy capital. So again, it is not really able to function as a business. So then the alternative system, which is basically the system that's going everywhere, is the idea of hierarchy. And so some of the strengths and weaknesses that we have here for hierarchy is that it's more of a command and control, and so it's less efficient. There's the energy that it takes to exert force over others just leads to that efficiency. And so progress overall tends toward efficiency. So that's one of the thinkings about how this will ultimately come undone. But getting into the strengths here, there's a clarity of authority structure. You have this pyramid. It's kind of everybody knows who they're reporting to. There's a product consistency because you're kind of imposing these standards on everybody down chain that are further down the pyramid, and people start working towards a role that they're assigned. And then there are clearly defined lines of communication. Power is more easily contained or controlled. But again, that creates inefficiencies or weaknesses because you're trying to force other people to act in accordance to your needs from them. there's a clear way of having a structured mentorship or knowledge transfer. Um, Employees or roles within the organization are interchangeable. So you can kind of just copy and paste different people into the same places or functions. There's a clear brand and identity. And also it's the current standard. So everybody's just trained to function in this way. And also as a organization, it's able to raise, hold, and deploy capital. So some of the weaknesses is that the business development is primarily by leadership, um, less reliant on the network, more regionally based or restricted, which constrains the skills, knowledge, opportunities, limited presence outside of specific territories, more susceptible to economic fluctuations. And part of that is because the wealth distribution is minimized to just a handful of top employees. And the rest of the employees, if things turn south, they don't have a lot to fall back on. And so they become more bound to the success of this one structure. It becomes expensive to operate with a lot of overhead. There's inefficient distribution of tasks and resources, requires more infrastructure to keep it moving, prone to bottlenecks and single points of failure just because decisions have to be made specifically through this chain. Smaller capacity to innovate because people are set into their specific roles and they're not really requested to provide much beyond the role that they're brought in for. The roles are strictly defined, so people are interchangeable. Individuals are less able to contribute beyond the function of their role. Very task driven, so it becomes robotic and overlapping. And there's limited opportunity for growth and independent thought. One thing about this is I recently read that job satisfaction, like people reporting that they're fulfilled in their work, is like 20%. And this is a global stat. And that is an all-time high. And so if you have 80% of your people who are pretty checked out, that starts to become really inefficient and stagnant, and people aren't bringing what they have to the table. They're barely showing up just to do the minimum. So it's not a very inspiring thing. And the idea that 20% is an all-time high at a global scale is wild. And so one of the things that people who were satisfied in their jobs reported was that autonomy was a key thing in why they felt that way. So just throwing that in there. Moving on. So now strategy and tactics, space and time, empires and rebellions. The reason for including this in the slide deck here is to show that hierarchies pretty heavily rely on strategic ways of being, and pure hierarchy and networks are very tactical. And so is there a way to unite strategy and tactics? But I'm showing here, that's a point of showing here kind of like what goes into it. So strategy is more spatially oriented. You think of like bases, ports, hubs. It's very centralized, defined and controlled territory. Think like law and order, imposing laws and order. They're hierarchically oriented, top down, command and control, like generals or chiefs, that kind of idea. Permission and approval. But strategic organizations are more expensive to maintain. So it's kind of like that high overhead idea. They have inbuilt inefficiencies. They're harder to keep adaptive and flexible, and they're subject to atrophy. And so that's why empires always end up falling. So tactics, the flaw of tactics is that it's kind of like the structure of a rebel group that's operating within the territory of a strategically held space. So they're usually the underdogs, kind of operating within another entity's realm. And so the information flows are horizontal versus the vertical information flows of strategy, which is also hierarchy and network. So they tend to be more temporally oriented, meaning that they'll take advantage of sort of opportunities in time and kind of like strike when the moment arrives, as opposed to like setting out a grand strategy of an overall place and trying to set up teams in specific locations to implement specific aims, that kind of thing. It's like, oh, here's an opportunity, let's jump on it. They're very network oriented. So it's like kind of who do we have in hand and what do they know? It's less about roles and functioning within a pyramid, but more of like, this is who we have and this is what they can bring to the table. How can we use that? So they become highly adaptive as well, highly efficient. They're very regenerative and innovative, inexpensive to operate. Again, distributed within the strategic territory. And the business is what it does, or the brand is the product and the product is the brand. So the group is what it does, essentially. So this idea of synarchy is to act in concert. Syn means to act in concert, and archy means to govern. So it's the idea of governing in concert, which brings the strategy and tactics together into one. So here is the diagram that I came up with for how a synarchy looks and how you would structure. Leads into the idea of how you structure a business, but just this diagram here is kind of like the abstract concept of synarchy, which is organized networks and strategy and tactics. So what you have here is a core that has these nodes within the core. And these nodes are circulating out into the greater world. And then these outer rings are implying like the bigger network that these nodes are touching in. So you have a network structure, you have these nodes that are connected to the outer world, but they're also circulating within this inner core. And so they're tied together by some binding force, if you're thinking about it just sort of in the abstract. And so the synarchy is more of like a hive or ant colony, where you have like, in a queen bee, or the is it called queen ant? The kind of like the main organizing element where the workers kind of move in and out, but there's the core, call it a core fractal in the core, in the center of the whole thing that keeps it organized. So by synarchy, also, I'm not referring to like the secret cabal of elites that are said to rule the world. I know that term has been applied in that way in kind of the conspiracy world. And also just stepping back, like to evolve is to transcend and include. So the idea here is that synarchy is kind of the evolution from heterarchy and hierarchy. And it transcends both of those, but includes them both. So the organizing component is sort of like the hierarchical component, where you have these nodes that are kind of within the core, moving in and out. And then the bigger network, these outer purple rings, is sort of the network structure. But instead of being a pure network where it's hard to see the overall, this central organizing force brings communication in and out. So you have these kind of lateral information flows, but you may also have some vertical information flows within this core. So it's fusion and transcendence of hierarchy and heterarchy. But the thing about this is that it's community governed, again, the way that a network is. So it's a community governed thing with an organizing focal point. So what, if you were to take this into business, what is that organizing element? Well, it's the organizing element becomes the shared purpose, or the shared alignment of trajectory between these various elements. So looking at the strengths and weaknesses of a synarchy, it's able to form groups for specific purposes in specific locations. So it's less bound to specific territory in the way that a hierarchy is. For business, you would be able to put together competitive fees and higher margins because you're maximizing the efficiency and minimizing the overhead. You could produce top tier work because you're able to pull tailored teams together. But again, I'm thinking of this through, let's say, the architecture lens, but it could be applied to different industries. But say you were going for a specific bid, you could tailor your team of consultants, and they could be located anywhere on earth, and you would put them together specifically to go after a bid that they maximizes that they're particularly skilled at pursuing. Whereas if you have a centralized business with a select group of teams, those people have to be able to just kind of go after whatever you're going after, regardless of whether it's in line with their expertise. Um, this structure is very forward looking because it embraces technological and social trends. I think particularly the younger generations are going to be more apt to working in this way, as opposed to sitting in an office and some sort of centralized top down structure. So it's a unique business model that just by being unique is a competitive advantage, particularly for recruiting and business development. It just becomes an outlier. So the work assignments also become more tailored, like feeds the interest, talents, and passions of the people that are on there. So if I don't like doing specific tasks, I could just go for the tasks that I do want to do, and other people who do like doing the tasks that I don't would take those on. And so it's basically like these core nodes become more like a consultant interchange instead of an employee. And so consultants then take greater ownership of their work because they're kind of being hired on a contract basis, and the way they get hired is by doing good work. So also it better leverages the network to generate more business. So now you're trying to incentivize these outer networks to bring business into the core and activate all the energy that's kind of latent out in this periphery by bringing greater dialogue between the core and the periphery. So it becomes more high, it becomes very innovative and flexible, and it can expand between different markets, industries, and sectors. So thinking architecture again, one of these nodes could be an architect, another could be an interior designer, another could be a landscape architect, one's maybe a project manager, another one's maybe like a contractor who does the building. And so you could put together teams that span all these different arenas and deliver kind of a comprehensive product at a much lower price and probably generating higher margins. It becomes more economically stable and resilient because you're distributing the economic base between the core and this bigger network. You have multiple redundancies depending on how big this team is. Maybe you have a lot of different experts in different arenas. And then there's lower overhead because it's more of like a collection of consultants, and you're not necessarily occupying a shared office space and having a lot of the overhead that maybe you have. Also, the work is being done more efficiently on a contract basis. I'll get into that also. Best and brightest are often quirky and independent. So something like this likely attracts those people. Again, thinking in the creative realm and the architecture world. So it attracts the more extraordinary people as opposed to the people that are really more happy functioning in a straight hierarchy. But again, I'll get into this moving forward, but hierarchy can also function within this world. So it's not, as you start to move beyond the idea of this just being an individual business, you'll see that there's more opportunity for everybody. And also it's just easier to govern because you have lateral information flows. You're not trying to oversee kind of the pyramid and make sure everybody's fitting in their precise way. You're hiring people because they're that person. So it becomes a self-governed consultant team instead of like a top-down kind of employer-employee thing. Key weaknesses, it's reliant on the availability, dependability of the consultants. So it's very important to put together kind of like a top tier consultant squad. You have less control over the consultant's work or their time. So again, it's very dependent on who you bring into this circle. Potential for high consultant turnover as well, since you're not bringing them in and hiring them as an employee and having that employer-employee dynamic. They can kind of come and go. It's very individually contract driven. So again, it requires a very intentional recruiting strategy for who is brought in. The work standards and styles are just more reliant on the consultant skills and are less standardized. Um, they're less, you might have a variety of graphic and just quality styles coming back. And not that one is greater than the other, but in the architectural world, there's something to be said for having like a consistent look or aesthetic to what you're doing. So there's the mentorship process is a little bit more complicated when you don't have a centralized hub or shared space. So it requires a little bit more intention. And maybe this structure is probably less appealing for those who prefer standard deployment arrangements. But again, as this scales up and down, there's a lot more options for how that can work. And it lacks a common focal point if not properly governed. So this could devolve into like the artist collective thing if it's not set up in the right way that keeps this core held together. So that's the key thing, is how do we hold this core, but then provide a lot of freedom and movement between the networks and the kind of core itself. So it's more reliant on trust. If you're thinking about this at the basic business level, where it's just, let's say, a group of 8 people working together, they all have to really trust each other. So putting to get this together as like a single business is a difficult thing to do. And so it must be both curated and expansive. Requires some inbuilt checks and balances, but that can also be resolved with the technological system that I'll get into as well. But think like you hired somebody to do the construction documents part of a project and they fail, then you don't have that, and that you don't have any recourse. So you have to build these checks and balances to make sure that whoever you bring in is delivering. So again, like if this is such a powerful structure, then why don't you see it more in the world? And so there's some hurdles to establishing a synarchy, and I'll start by talking about how you'd go from an existing business, how you would transfer an existing hierarchical company into a synarchy. Well, first and foremost, what this would require is that somebody went and built up this whole business, got it to a successful level, has the brand, has the clients, and then decides like, hey, I'm just going to let go of all this control that I've amassed and all this wealth, and I'm going to start turning it back over to the collective. And so that just never happens. First and foremost, you'd have to have that take place. Once you, let's say you got leadership that would like to do that, the way you could convert it into a synarchy is you start reevaluating some of the roles and strategies, and then taking different initiatives that you could test to see if they result in more activated networks and expanded gravity. And so the concept of gravity is like I'll step back here. This outer green sphere is kind of like the idea of the gravity of this overall put together. And so the more you can push that outward and expand it to touch more and more people, the more energy you're going to get moving back and forth between the core and the outer. So you're trying to expand, take this triangular structure here and push outward and create a bigger gravitational pull from your outer networks. And so you're going to start looking at different initiatives that you can take, and then try to review, like, does it result in expanding the gravity and activating the networks more? Does it, and that could be through workflows, through financial flows, like the talent pool. Are you drawing more talent into your arena? The business operations, is that starting to kind of morph into a different way of functioning? And so some of the framing ones is, again, this idea of expanded gravity, which is the entity. I'm calling it an entity as opposed to a business or company, plus its network. Maybe one lens is like how to have resources available at any cost. Or another is internalizing as much good business as possible within the greater network. So maybe you can help somebody out here in this greater network get work, and ultimately down the road, they may bring work back in. And so you're starting to think more in terms of just helping this bigger arena and less about just pulling business into your sphere immediately, trusting that kind of having goodwill and assisting the greater sphere that you're working in ends up coming back to you at some point. Inspiration through autonomy, maybe taking some measures that create more autonomy within for your employees and for people within your network. And some of that could be personal growth and development too, like starting to think about how you can inspire the people that that were your employees that you're now kind of wanting to turn loose and have them start to operate more as a consultant. So thinking that anything that benefits the network is a benefit to the company or entity. And then since you've established this hierarchy, can you leverage what advantages do you have that you can leverage in transitioning from more of a company to an entity, a synarchic entity? So maybe some of the initiatives that you look at are related to your recruiting strategy or leadership roles or the new projects or markets that you're going after. Employee incentives. This could be like where you're starting to promote autonomy. Employee input, taking some thoughts from your employees for how you can make this transition work. And looking at the workflows within your network. These are just some hypotheticals, but that's how an existing hierarchical company could theoretically start functioning more as like a synarchy and start kind of morphing into this networked structure. So that's the idea here. But then also establishing a synarchy from scratch has its own difficulties because, the way a hierarchy forms is that, let's say, a singular person in the architecture world has a client that gives them enough business that they're able to hire some people, and then maybe that grows, and then they're able to hire a few more people, and they get some new clients, and it's basically kind of like starting small and it just grows, but it's one person kind of like pursuing their own vision and bringing people in to support them in their vision. But with a synarchy, you have to put together a team of basically equals, and without a real client base or project base necessarily, and go establish those things, kind of take a collection of individuals and create a name for those individuals, a brand, get work, and then repeat your processes throughout. And it's also just not done very much in this world now. So it's just a new idea. So it's a harder thing to spin up and maybe sell to clients and have people understand what you're all about. But essentially it would become a cyclical process where you'd have to build the consultant pool, go and get work, and also the soonest and best jobs available. It's a time factor. This is where becomes a tactical pursuit. And create a team from that consultant pool based on the work that you get that can fulfill that job. So once you get that job, you put that team together and then do the work, and then you go and have to do it again. You have your consultant pool, you try to get a project, put the team together for the project, and then refine your processes. Do it again. And so your standards and procedures are developed over time through repetition. You refine the teams, the consultant pool, and the processes with each project. And you start to establish an overarching system of operating principles that attract more people and businesses into the entity that is taking form. So you're having to spin up this thing and create gravity and build a core group of people that are functioning within it. And it's just a harder way to go than a singular person who has a client and just can kind of hire people on specific terms and then build that way. But once something like this is spun up, it would be very competitive. So maybe rethinking that is a worthy proposition, and looking at how to incorporate technology to make that process a little bit more feasible. So this slide, the main point of it is to show that um, the main point of it is to show that you can allow hierarchy to work within synarchy very well. It's harder to allow synarchy to work within hierarchy. And particularly when we get into the idea of how this whole thing gets leveraged through blockchain, this doesn't occur within trying to tie this into a hierarchical world. Um, so you can see here, this diagram, there's the pyramid, the triangle of hierarchy. And then within it, you're having these synarchic teams. And so maybe there's like a division within a company or a couple divisions within the company that have a little bit of autonomy and function in their own way. But the benefits of that are very hindered by being tied within this bigger pyramid. And the gravity is still pretty much bound to the outer fringes of this pyramid. So it's little impact to the company's ability to expand into new markets or sectors. It's kind of within the core competence of the company itself. It doesn't alter the Pareto principle in the same way as full synarchy, which is a very interesting aspect of synarchy that I'll get into. But that's the principle that 20% of the people do 80% of the work in most organizations. So doesn't greatly expand the company's gravity, as you can see. Limited impacts to business development. Top-down control is still maintained, so you still kind of have these vertical information flows, even though within it there might be some horizontal information flows within small groups. It's not liberating in the same way that synarchy is, so it kind of faces the same employee engagement issues, even if it's just one little group feels a little bit more liberated. Efficiency gains are limited to select teams or departments. Revenue gains limited to select teams, departments. Doesn't really expand the talent pool of the company so much because you're not, these reaching out into the networks are just very limited. And at the same time, any draw from these outer periphery is still just captured inside this overall. Doesn't fully unleash the power of networks. Just I think I just got little or no reductions in overhead also. Doesn't provide the independence of full synarchy. So still single source of income for the team members in this world, supported by the company, not the broader network. Team members are more bound to the company itself, and the company is more bound to the localized economy. So still very much a hierarchical thing. Still utilizes vertical flows, information flows, hinders growth, knowledge acquisition, hinders ease of governance gains. Overall business structure remains less flexible than synarchy. So fewer and less creative business to employee to a client arrangements versus with synarchy, entity to consultant to client arrangements. There's way more flexibility in how all of those various arrangements could be made in synarchy, which we'll get into also. Resources are more restricted to what the company provides for the synarchy and not the greater network, and more difficult to tailor teams for specific tasks since it's a limited pool within the company. So here, synarchy in business, it's a networked organism with a point of focus, and we've begun to touch on it as I was getting into the strengths and weaknesses, kind of touching on how some of the strengths and weaknesses are related to a business operation. Now we're getting into how synarchy functions as a business, as a singular business. So here's the concept of the entity's gravity, the outer periphery. It's the business plus the core talent plus the active networks equals the sum of energy flows. So the business or entity is this central thing. The core talent are these nodes, let's say, here. And then the active networks is the movement between the nodes and the outer world. One note about the general economy is that there's a one-to-one link between energy production and GDP. So in, let's say, the United States, the amount of energy we generate, let's say it's oil or solar or wind or nuclear, whatever methods that we generate energy to run industry, there's a one-to-one link between that and our GDP. And so if you kind of take that principle to this local scale of a singular entity, unlocking latent energy within the business itself and its extended networks unlocks additional money flows. So the gambit here with setting up a synarchy versus a hierarchy is that the resources are shared more equally among the people within this entity, but you're banking on having more resources flowing in and out because you're reaching further into the outer world and activating these networks from how you set this business up and from the incentives that you set up for the networks, both contributing inward and the contributions that you make outward. So think of that founder who's setting up the hierarchy and then deciding to give up control. One reason why they might decide to do that is because they're banking on taking less of the pie, but increasing the pie dramatically by turning over some control to the collective. And I believe a structure like this would generate way more revenue in business than a standard hierarchical model once it was up and running. So here, the entity nodes, each of these nodes could be a singular consultant, but they could also be a business itself. So this is where the hierarchy can fit within the network. Like one of these nodes could be a whole design firm that has a leader and all the people running down, but they just bring their work in and out. So this still allows for regular businesses to be part of this thing, which also allows for regular businesses to hire people who want to work for a regular business and don't want to be like a hired gun consultant type of person, you know? And so this is where a lot of the flexibility and adaptability comes in also. So the core entity itself is a synarchy, also known as a holarchy. The relationship is primarily with consultants and businesses, as opposed to a business with direct employees, although the collective could decide that they would want to employ some direct employees, and we'll get into that too. The function of this is to organize and create networks of humans and businesses who are united through a shared purpose. The function is the mission, and the mission is the function. So that's kind of, we've touched on how that works, but that is the organizing principle of a synarchy versus a network, is the shared purpose. So it becomes a circulating interchange in which everyone is bringing in work, doing work, and primarily doing the work that is of their interest, talents, and passions. As a consultant, you can go and bid for what you are good at and what you're capable of delivering. And if it's not of interest to you, it creates more flexibility to turn it down. Whereas the way the world works now, you do the work that your employee brings in and needs you to do. And a lot of it is work that you don't want to do. And so it's less inspiring and less creative and less flexible. And this allows the flexibility to have people hone in on what they're really good at. And another person takes that thing that I'm not good at and they do it. And I do something that's maybe I love, but somebody else doesn't. And so you divvy it out based on interest, talents, and passions. Also, this core entity constantly collects and distributes finances. And then this is a key factor here. The finances are distributed in direct proportion to each individual's work contributions. So if this is a singular business and at the end of the year, I do 3% of the work and you do 8%, you get 8% of the overall pie. I get 3%. And it's just based exactly on how much you've done. And with fees getting distributed on a routine basis and then a year-end basis. And it's formed through a progressive letting go of control. This is where like a hierarchy kind of steps back and lets you start to distribute control and you turn it over to the group itself. And And then there's natural mechanisms for scaling up or down. And it's a factor of the number of people within the entity's gravity. And we'll get into that. This is a key idea. It brings in, it becomes a fractal situation. And it's less oriented around single clients or point sources of income, and more oriented around reputation and random things that come and go in and out of the network. You can still have those reliable, consistent clients, but then you're also getting more stuff from other places that you're not expecting because you're integrating this overall entity with a bigger world in a much different way, and incentivizing that bigger world to feed back into the entity. And it starts to become highly efficient and outcompete standard business models for all those reasons. That it doesn't have the same overhead. The people are doing the work that they like. It's on a bidding consultant basis, on and on and on. And so it prioritizes simplicity of functions over the simplicity of organizational structure. So you can see here, this diagram is a little bit more complicated than just a straight pyramid with some lines between nodes in a cascading upward way. But the idea is that the functioning is more simple. So say somebody has a question about log cabins in the mountains, and it's like, oh, I'll just call Bruce over here. He's an expert on log cabins in the mountains, and it's like, it's more like that than saying, okay, well, who do I talk to about this within this organizational structure? And maybe they don't know. And so it's simplicity of functions over structure. So now I'll have some slides about how this whole thing kind of functions in general. But actually, entity here, the core, it could be it'll hold the technology and the infrastructure that way. It could hold the business operations stuff, some of the branding, some of the name of it, instead of just being Joe Bob consultant number 2, he's an entity, he's a person, he's part of Florescence. So when he's going out and talking to people, he can say, oh yeah, I'm part of Florescence. And they're like, oh yeah, okay, I understand. There's a name there. The entity itself is this talent pool. So that in itself is a resource, just a collection of talented people. And then the main one is driving the finances. So this is where the money flows in and out of this core, between the in and out. So this next slide here, we're just focusing on how the consultant nodes and the entity interact. So this blue circulating arrow is one of these nodes here on this diagram, one of these core people, let's say. So the consultant here, they provide to this core entity here, which was the whole circle within the middle of that diagram, network and connections, that linkage to the greater world, their core skills, talents, and passions. So they bring themselves and what they're capable of, and they exist autonomously. It's on a contract basis that they interact with the core entity. So the core entity itself is that talent pool. So the consultant could go to the core entity to get project support. Let's say they landed a job and they need somebody to help them with the job. They go to the core entity and say, hey, I need that person, and that person. Are you guys interested? And try to put together a team. The core entity could have a job that's brought in from somewhere else, and they go to this consultant and say, hey, we need you for this. So the core entity is a source of employment opportunities for the consultant. The core entity is that brand and identity. So this consultant, by being engaged with the core entity, is a member of Florescence and can tell the greater world, hey, I'm part of Florescence, so you should love me. And the core entity also provides business infrastructure, technology, or some support. So if there's some business functions that you need, or some technology that you're in need of, maybe some programs, that kind of stuff, that could be incorporated in here, or just some basic support in running a business that could be provided through this core entity. But again, this is all community governed. So whatever this entity holds is decided on by the community. So we'll get into that too. But this consultant has a voice about what this entity puts resources towards having. And as it scales beyond just being a business to encompassing like entire sectors or entire industries, or even going up to the scale of the entire economy, what is held here could really expand. And then financial distribution. So the consultant gets a piece of the pie by contributing to the pie. Also, what the consultant brings to the core entity are these connections to the greater world. So the consultant has a local presence so wherever that consultant is located, they're connected to a local presence in that location that then brings connections to this core entity. So as an abstract thing that exists out in La La Land, each consultant ties it to the earth. So let's say we have one person in Paris and another person in Denver and another person in San Francisco and one in New York, and having people in all these different locations opens opportunities in all of those locations. So if you think about that, instead of having like a hub of people that all live in Denver and they all commute from the suburbs and they all like join in this one office and do the work in this one office and they're connected to the development world in Denver, this expands out greatly. So just by wherever these people are located, they create a presence there for this entity, which leads to business contacts and opportunities in different locations as well, and leads to they may have a team of sub-consultants, or they may have direct employees. Like this consultant could be a business in their own right, could be a 20-person team. And so they're bringing all of that into this picture. And then they're connected to other professionals. So maybe this consultant is an architect, 20-person team. And then that 20-person team all has their network connections and they know all their other people. And so it just starts to have this network effect. The bigger it gets and the better the incentives are to bind this network into the core. And that's where money comes into play too. But again, also touching back on this Pareto principle, it becomes applied in a different way. So in a regular business, let's say 20% of the people are doing 80% of the work. That means that you have 80% of the employees doing a much less share, and that's very inefficient. But if everybody is kind of operating on a contract basis, if this consultant is only engaged with the entity on specific contracts that it gets hired to work on, 20% of the work of this core entity could still be done or 80% of the work still could be done by just 20% of the consultants that are engaging with the entity, but 100% of that work is contracted. So any of the inefficiencies within that setup are on the consultant themselves. It's not the entity's inefficiencies. So you hire me to do contract documents and put together all these construction details, and I give my price for it and we get the bid. And then if I overshoot my price, then I'm kind of eating that. It's not on the entity's dime. And so that's kind of how the inefficiencies get ironed out. But at the same time, I'm getting stake in the overall by doing the work for the entity. So it just becomes a very efficient interchange, and that'll come through also the more we get into this explanation. So the financial flows, this is the key thing. This diagram, so the green core is the entity. That's the core of all that other diagram, and it collects and distributes money. And so you can see this movement where it's money is coming in and going out. That's what the idea of how that circulation is taking place. And then these blue arrows going in and out, it's sort of merging that consultant and their network into one flow coming in and out of the entity. So it's the talent pool providing labor and projects throughout the year. And that provision of projects is key as well. So basically you have the entity, and then you have the networks, the greater networks, including the consultant in that, bringing money and work into the entity, and the entity distributing that money back out, and that work back out to the networks. So on a weekly and monthly basis, the entity will distribute pay at defined rates. So I'm working on a contract for them. As I'm doing the work, I get paid on a kind of consistent flow. So this keeps people afloat throughout the year. And the pay is based on what tier of work I'm able to do and what tier of work I bid on. So let's say maybe tier 1 work at $8 per hour. Let's say that's like the high paid stuff that an entry level person just isn't going to be able to do. And so that's what I get paid at that hour, because I'm doing that higher tier work. Or let's say I bid on the tier 4 work at D dollars per hour. That's fine too. I'm just doing like some basic work, but it doesn't, whoever you get, whatever you're bid on and whatever you get hired to do. And so theoretically you would want to bid on the highest tier work that you're capable of accomplishing, but maybe you love just doing something else. And so you're like, oh, yeah, I can do that now. I'd love to do that. And so you just have these rankings based on like the requirement of it, like the caliber of knowledge and skill that's required to do it. And then the key thing is bringing in work. Anybody can do this. So this is where you don't even have to be a designer. You don't have to be an architect. You don't have to be any of it. You could just know somebody who has a job and it's like, hey, bring it into the entity. I get a percentage of the contract just for bringing that work into the entity itself. And this is where you're starting to leverage the network to start feeding the entity as well. You're creating incentives for work to come into this thing. And then at the end of the year, whatever is left over and above kind of like the weekly and monthly distributions as the overall profit of the entity, that gets distributed back to all of the contributors through the year at a 1-to-1 ratio with each individual's overall contribution. So if you bring in work, and the work that you brought in, no matter whether you do it or not, just you bring a job to the entity, that it gets picked up, you get your percent of that contract. Whatever that percentage equates to in the overall, you'll get paid just to bring work in. A share, you're getting stake in the overall just from doing that. But then let's say you do work and you do a bunch of contracts, and at the end you get whatever your 5, 7, whatever your percentage is in the overall, you get that percentage back in the profits. So it all gets distributed based on your direct contribution, 1-to-1. So that starts incentivizing a lot of people to come into this thing, a lot of people to feed it. It starts being the key mechanism by which the networks are activated. It is a huge aspect of how this thing becomes so powerful. And then, okay, so this is great too. I love this. So the idea of how this thing scales up and down, it's a process of expansion and contraction as opposed to the hiring and firing. Process of expansion and contraction and dispersal/concentration rather than hiring and firing. So the number of people are balanced with the overall workload throughout the network. The company scales as people and work comes and goes, so it's fully people supported. And the network structure helps buffer the entity against greater economic turmoil, because you're tied in with a bigger picture. So like think about it, the ant colony is as big as the number of ants are in the colony. That's kind of like so as it grows and contracts, it's still an ant colony. It's just a factor of how many ants are tied to the colony. So here, if you think about it at the core basic level, you have a core competence and a core talent pool. Just have a handful of people. And so the gravity is very concentrated and the workload is very concentrated. So you see these dark blue rings There's not even much of a net, like it's not really tying into a network. It's a core group of people doing all the work, and the gravity is very contracted. And then you move up a tier, and so you get some of the work being dispersed through a greater pool. These dark blue circulation rings are kind of becoming less dark. You have a core competence with a few other capacities and sectors added beyond this core talent, and the core talent sort of like spreads maybe to some additional sectors here. Some dispersal of work and control takes place as it expands. The gravity gets bigger, and it just becomes a bigger factor of movement between the network, the number of people in these networks, number of people in the core scales up and down. Then even farther, you expand out, keeps growing, bring in some network activation. Maybe some of these networks interlink, you're pulling in new, more and more sectors. So broader talent pool, more sectors, more skills, greater dispersal of work and control. So this core group is responsible for less and less of the overall. And you start adding capacities and sectors. And so this is where it's maybe like at this level, it's like a small ragtag group of architects. And at this level, it's like the potential is that it's the whole industry. And that could be developers, that could be contractors doing all the building, it could be multidisciplinary. So every design skill, graphic design, interior design, architects, landscape architects, signage, lighting, every aspect of design that you could put into this whole industry, all under one roof and being governed by one system. So yeah, it's really like a scale. It's a factor of how many people are brought in. It just scales up and down. And it's the same diagram top to bottom. So now if you start, this is where originally I was thinking about this just as a singular business. And then I came into contact. I found the book Read, Write, Own by Chris Dixon. And in that book, he had these diagrams here on the left related to technological networks. And I hadn't really thought about, I was thinking about this thing as like, okay, so if you put together a group of people that you knew and you guys all trusted each other and made this thing work, and maybe you had some deal set up between you that would make it so that like you had like just some arrangement where the money was shared, but it would require so much trust, and just like to spin one of these up is really hard. You'd almost have to do it as like a hierarchy first and then be the person who starts handing over control. But then I saw this and it really changed my thinking about the scale of how this thing could operate and why. And so basically what he was saying is looking at this really in terms of the networks that are set up in various utilizing various technologies. So like originally looking at it, it was like a protocol network, which was like the early email and the web, these SMTP and HTTP, and they're both logically and organizationally decentralized. So the very structure of the network here, as you can see, it's like a bunch of creators and developers and users just kind of bumping around like in that artist collective way. The only way the network gets maintained is if people volunteer their time. You can't really like set up a email platform that's going to make money because it's just a protocol network that it's just as good as any other protocol network. So if you pair this idea of this technological network with a business network that we were just marching through, it'd look like this diagram here of mine. Basically the same exact diagram, right? Which, I mean, that makes sense. People kind of understand how networks function together. But there is no business. Like you can't turn that into a business really. The network just is what it does. And as we've gone through, but you can see the parallels between that diagram and that diagram. So then what came along after all that was these corporate networks like Facebook, TikTok, YouTube. And what they did was they were both logically and organizationally centralized. So logically meaning that the company hierarchically controlled the whole thing. And organizationally meaning that they controlled also how the network functions. So the creators, developers, and users are still circulating kind of around the periphery of this company, not driving how the network functions, but the company is driving how they fit within the whole thing. And so as a business diagram, basically it's this hierarchy. The business model is that it's a hierarchy. It's all business. Everything is governed by the corporation. So Zuckernuts can decide what posts get seen and who rises to prominence. They can decide all the algorithm, how it functions, decide how much money they're going to pull out of the overall, if they're going to let any of the people, the creators or users or any of those developers make any money. Again, logically and organizationally centralized. But then here, when I came to this blockchain network and saw his blockchain diagram, that's when I had like the oh shit moment, because that is essentially the same exact diagram as this Synarchy diagram that I drew. And in a blockchain, he's talking about it in terms of like a social media network. So a blockchain social media platform that is set up on the blockchain would have the community at the core and the creators, developers, and users feeding back and forth. They're speaking back and forth. Basically, the blockchain is a synarchy. And so, particularly with Bitcoin, the problem with some of these others is that they're still owned by a hierarchy. The real example is Bitcoin, that is logically centralized and organizationally decentralized. So what that means is that the logical centralization is that this core is determined by the community. It's community governed. But the core itself exists as like an organizing force. There's that shared purpose that exists here. And that exists because all of these nodes out here get to decide how this thing functions overall. So it's a network with a point of focus. And that point of focus is the centralization of the logic of it. It's functional logic. So looking at his two diagrams here, you have the way a corporate social media network is set up and the way a blockchain social media network is set up. You have this thing going on here, right? Like this core entity with these nodes tied to this core entity. The difference between what he's describing here and what I'm describing here is that in his diagram, Ethereum and Warpcast, which is a social media platform that's set up on the blockchain, can have this organizational structure for how it functions as a social media platform, but still be owned by a group. What this here is describing is that this core company could be placed right there, which almost nobody would consider doing, is creating a business that is a community and vice versa. And that's what this is. So this cannot be like Ethereum or Warpcast. This is Bitcoin, the community owned business. And instead of just being a tool of financial speculation and value, holding of value, it's the organizing principle for how people work together. So that's where we get into here. Blockchain and Synarchy, there's a structural alignment. And by slightly tweaking Chris Dixon's diagram, putting the company and the community at the core, making them the same exact thing. The community is the company. It is the diagram that I drew here. And I understand that we're just talking diagrams here, but this is where I realized that this thing that I was looking at could become an entire industry, could take over an entire industry, could change the way the global order operates, could return power back to the community, both financial and technologically. Now we're not talking about some tech overlord who's trying to sell us on the fact that this bright, beautiful technological future is going to be owned by them. This is how this bright, beautiful technological future is owned by the communities, by you and me, by whoever's contributing. So what we've done now is we've taken this entity or organizing element, the community core, and put a business function there where the financial distribution mechanisms are written into a code that can only be changed by community decisions. And you have the greater community feeding in and out from there. What we have here is a fractal situation. The Synarchy is fractal. And governed by blockchain technology, it means you can go from what I was originally envisioning as like a singular group of people or a small selection of like a business or a consultant team that's going and getting work and trying to compete with other consultants and business teams. You can now scale up to like a collection of multidisciplinary businesses or consultant teams. So the company I work for right now could just be one triangle here and still have all of us as employees and just fitting into this place within the entity. And they bring the work into the entity. The current work that they internalize, they could drop into this entity, get percentage cut of the entity for bringing work into there, do the work still with the team that they already have, and be feeding this bigger network. Or this person could just be a singular consultant that gets hired to do work here and there, and starts to get paid. Maybe they know people out in this world that can bring work in here. It's just scaling up again. But with blockchain technology, where the contracts are open, where all of the fee structure, everything is encoded into the technology, it enables thousands and thousands of people who do not know each other to all engage with the same entity and have all of the rules coded into it and not be cheated for. You can, any people who do not trust each other can all still cooperate in this bigger arena. So this Synarchy of original just concept for people, like a handful of people functioning a new way in business, could scale up to the point of being like an entire industry or economy. Like the entire construction world could now be governed by a Synarchy, and all these nodes could be like, this could be the architecture world, all the architecture firms in the US. This could be all the landscape architecture firms in the US. This could be all interior designers. Like the whole arena of the development world could be builders, could be developers. Say you're a developer and you put all of your projects into that entity and you're doing like 20% of the development in the US or something, and you're getting a stake in the overall based on that. You could, depending on how much money this overall entity brings in, you could almost start getting paid to develop, because the cost of developing is smaller than all of the financial benefits that are coming back to you from contributing to the network. And what this opens is the potential for this entity to start incorporating other businesses, because now you start coalescing a whole industry or a whole sector or something like that, a whole economy. Now you could fold in conferences, conventions. You could have a LinkedIn where all the designers have their portfolios up, and that's how you choose your pool. So you're developing like a social media component, advertising. You could do product design, like companies that design furnishings or whatever. Maybe the entity itself starts to develop its own product lines, whatever. Now you're tapping into the whole industry. And if you're bringing in work for that industry or doing work for that industry, you're getting your stake in that overall industry. So if I do 0.005% of the work in the overall, and the overall, in addition to just my fees that I get from doing that, I would get a 0.005% share of the whole entire industry, which through the blockchain can be tokenized or however that's done. I just want to be very clear that this is blockchain technology, though. We're not talking about the financial speculation aspect of like Bitcoin and Ethereum and stuff like that. This is using the underlying technology of that blockchain structure to govern entire industries and distributing the money on a one-to-one basis with your overall contribution to that industry. It's a complete, it could like really compete or undermine how we're being controlled with money and really start to distribute wealth in direct proportion to how people contribute. And so what it starts to avoid are these debates about like capitalism versus communism or business versus government or all this stuff that, because it's not, it plugs into a capitalist system. And it's not communist in the sense of like having still a bigger authority that's pretending to be the redistribution mechanism or whatever and fighting on class war or whatever. It's strictly how much did you do, and this is what you get for doing it in direct proportion, and controlled by a technology that's transparent, open, has minimal cost to run it, and cannot be tampered with. It's all just open and clean. This is how it functions. And not only that, but as an individual business, this is where the fractal aspect of it comes into play, is that you could have synarchies within synarchies. So let's say me and 8 of my homeboys get together and we're going to do our own little mini synarchy. That's how we run our business. But then the bigger economy is run through a synarchy as well. And so you could have a synarchy at this scale plugging into one of these nodes here. And so we're sharing our funds between us just from what we collect as a business. But then as a business, we're getting our funds as a percentage of the overall work that we do as a small collective. And so it just scales up or down to whatever degree possible. So another key point about this synarchy and the way it scales is that at every scale, it's community governed. So whether it's a small group to this scale at the entire level of the industry. So all decisions are made by a vote of the community. And this is also how blockchain and tokenization can fit in, because that's how people vote in a blockchain, is by having stake in the overall. And tokens serve as that stake. So everybody who contributes to the overall structure has a say in how the overall structure functions. And so the concept of having minimal overhead, the community can also decide at any of these scales what functions they want to incorporate into the core entity. So at this group, maybe you're just looking at sort of like the key business functions, some technology, some stuff like that. But when you're starting to scale up to multidisciplinary teams or to like an entire industry, like what's conveyed here, maybe you start to fold in education programs or healthcare financial pools, or the community decides that they want to apportion some of the profits to having daycare and ways of supporting the families within the community, all being funded from this bigger pool. So this again is another way that this stabilizes the communities and becomes a more stable thing than if it's winner take all. Because winner take all, they take all the money, and then you as an employee or as some lower tier person within the pyramid, in addition to contributing your work, not getting paid based on what you contribute to the overall, you're still having to support your family and get your kids to schools, maybe schools that you don't want them to be at, that require you to do certain things to work within certain parameters, give your kids certain so-called medications just to be there. And so this starts to enable funds that would typically be pocketed by one or two people to be released and made available to bigger functions that could be provided based on what the community wants, not on what a handful of people at the top want. So that I want to reiterate that aspect of it as well, to where the stability that starts to be achieved potentially increases as this thing scales up from being just a minor group of misfits who are finding that they want to organize their business in a different way, to being open source, technologically governed redistribution mechanism that's governed by the community of people that are feeding it and that decide how they want it to feed them back. And now I realize I'm getting to be like in the dream mythical world of what the potential is here, but this is real. Like, this is a clear possibility of how the world could theoretically be operating. But even at the smaller scale, it's very liberating, and it could be a very exciting competitive structure for just a handful of people to do. And so going back to this last slide, that's kind of a repetition of the previous one. Essentially, what you have here is this gravity can expand to the sky's the limit. And so it can encompass the entire industries with active networks of those industries, getting additional revenue streams, and that's the sum of all the energy flows. And each of these nodes could be a consultant, individual consultant like myself, or an entire business like the one I work for, or an entire sector. Like, it could just be the whole landscape architecture world is funneled through that, or even beyond that. Like, it scales up and down to whatever degree you want. That's the fractal nature of it. So in conclusion, I guess I'll go back to that first slide I had put up, why Synarchy, and I'll repeat it. If it is possible, it is mandatory that we create businesses and industries that are guided by principles of human liberation and prosperity for all. And I think I've just shown that it is possible through this structure and utilizing blockchain technology. And so I believe that this Synarchic structure is a way to get there. And if you disagree, tell me. I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts about flaws in my thinking or limits to what I'm talking about, anything. But if you agree, take it and run with it. Form your own synarchies. Take it out into the world. That's the only way we move forward in this, as far as I'm concerned, is that only through community are we going to take control of our lives and fight against the prevailing forces of economic and technological control. We're hurtling towards total and complete economic control and total and complete technological control. And the only way I see us getting out of it is through community action and community organization. And this concept has the potential to take that community scale to the globe and that community decision making to the globe. We have it. It is possible, so it is mandatory. Tell me if you agree or disagree. But thank you for listening.